how many of you are giving talks at this conference? All right, how many of you have already given your talks? All right, I promise I did not attend your talk, and so if I say anything critical about your style, I'm not making fun of you specifically. Well, probably not. I mean, I have attended talks of yours before, so. You know.
I actually didn't think so, but now I'm wondering.
Although I did attend Lisa's talk, and I'm happy to say that she followed all of my guidelines, even though she didn't attend my talk. So that's good. For those of you that came in a little bit earlier, you saw my pre-talk ritual. I do this every time because, as I'll talk about later, I've watched myself giving presentations, and I have a tendency to fiddle with stuff in my pockets and to fiddle with my lanyard. And these are just practical tips that I encourage you to intentionally think about before you step up to the podium. What can you do to make sure that you don't sabotage your own talk? And so that's what this list is. Your list is different. This is my list. So think about that. Think about what your list is as you step into this talk. The second thing I want to mention is that I have answers, but they might not be your answers. And what I'm encouraging you to take away from this talk is not to do exactly as I do, but to think about what makes you the most effective and be very intentional about that. Don't just step up to the podium and start talking. Think about it ahead of time and make sure that you plan your talk for your own success. So, my name is Rich Bowen, and I am an open source strategist at AWS. And I have been attending technical and non-technical conference presentations since about 1997. And so I've attended a lot of really bad talks and a lot of really great talks, and I've given a lot of talks myself. And what I want to talk about is how you can make your presentation better. And the reason that I care about this is that the people in this room are the face of open source. And when you give bad talks, you make us all look bad. But more importantly, you discourage people from coming to join us. So what I want you to do as you go through this is think about talks that you've attended that were really awesome, and specifically why you think that. But also about talks that you attended that were terrible and why you think that. And I encourage you over the next 2.5 days to attend at least one talk where you don't care about the topic and focus on the presentation and think about how you can improve your own presentation based on what you learn there. So this guy is Damian Conway, and I haven't attended one of his talks for 20 years, and yet even now, the way that he gave talks influences how I give talks. Best presenter I think I've ever attended, and he used to be very prolific in the Perl community, which is where I got mostly involved in open source. And when I started giving presentations, I was terrible, and I attended Damian's talks, and I was determined to be like him. Now, I'm reading a book right now that's an autobiography of a musician, and he talks about his influences. And if you have lots of influences, then you come up with unique ideas. If you only have one influence, then you tend to mimic. And so I encourage you to have lots of influences and not just find someone to mimic. But when I started speaking, I mimicked Damian because he was brilliant. This terrible picture is Kathy Sierra, and she presented at the Ohio Linux Fest probably 10 years ago, and probably the best conference presentation I've ever attended. If you ever are at a conference where she is speaking, if you don't care about her topic, go to her talk because she's brilliant. She makes you care about the topic. And yeah, it's a terrible picture. But several of her presentations are on YouTube. She's really worth watching. This is Mark Jason Dominus, and I attended a talk by him almost 20 years ago called Prensentation Aikido. And he was the first person to tell me that my presentations were terrible. Find someone who will tell you that your presentations are terrible and why. Someone that you trust, not just somebody to heckle, although heckling is an important aspect of presentations. And if you want to heckle, feel free to do that, because that always, engagement with your community. So Ruth is my heckler in the back there. But for some reason, Damien is playing a harmonica, and Damien always found a way to make his talks memorable. So lots of great advice, and he's a big reason why I have confidence to stand up here on stage and hope that maybe you'll laugh at one or two of my jokes. The fourth person I'm going to show is, oh my goodness, I've lost his name. This was a presenter at FOSS Asia in Hanoi a couple months ago. And he was just so engaging because he cared passionately about his topic. So this slide is to remind me to tell you, don't talk about something you don't care about. That sounds obvious, but I attend a lot of talks where the presenter doesn't seem to care about what they're talking about. And this is, of course, me back when my beard wasn't white. And I want to tell you why I care about this and why you should care. So I already mentioned I attend a lot of conference talks. I end up having a lot of my time wasted by presenters who shouldn't be on stage or who didn't take it seriously. When you stand on stage, you have, in theory, you have 30 minutes, but really you have about 2 minutes to persuade people that they should stay and talk to you and not go find the talk next door, which is probably more interesting. And so I want to give you 8 very practical tips that will improve your presentation, I think. So the first thing is that you should know what your talk is about. Now, I recognize that sounds like a stupid thing to say, but if you don't know what your talk is about, your audience won't either. And I can't tell you how many talks I've left thinking, what on earth were they talking about? What were they trying to communicate? And it's, if somebody missed your talk and you had to tell them in the elevator what your talk was about, can you do that before they get to their floor? Because if you can't, then you need to go back to the drawing board and figure out what specific thing you're trying to communicate and focus on that one thing, because some famous scientist, I can't remember who it was, said if you can't explain your thought concisely, then maybe you don't understand it yourself. And I've seen that quoted and misquoted so many times that I can't remember who said it, but that's irrelevant. Specifically, you should have a call to action. When people leave the room, they should know what you expect them to go do. So here's mine. I want you to leave this talk and think about 2 or 3 things you can improve on your talk that you're going to be giving later in this week. And maybe you leave this room in a panic and say, I really have to rewrite my entire presentation. Or maybe you leave it and say, yeah, I think I've got a handle on this. And either one of those is a great outcome. But I want you to know when you step up on stage what you want people to do when they leave the room. It needs to be specific, a specific call to action. And what do I want my audience to do? And like I said, I want you to give better talks. Now, I mentioned that talk in Hanoi that I attended. The presenter was excited about his talk. And if you go to a talk and the presenter is more bored than you are, then I encourage you to get up and leave. I encourage you to go to the talk next door. I try to only give talks that I am passionate about. When I'm in a position at work where I have to give a presentation on something that was assigned to me that I don't care about, I know that I'm not going to do as good a job as when I am passionate about it. So be excited or give a different talk. Point number 2, don't tell me your life story. Now this is a two-sided coin here, and I want to be very clear on what I'm saying here. When I stepped up on stage, I told you my name, my job title, and I told you why I'm kind of qualified to give this talk. So I'm Rich Bowen, I'm an open source strategist at AWS, and I've been attending terrible talks since 1997, and I don't want to attend any more terrible talks. I did not tell you about the amazing breakfast I had this morning. I can tell you about that in the hallway after, because there's a restaurant here in town that I make a point to come to every time I come to Denver. I'll tell you about that later. That's not part of this talk. That's irrelevant. I will be here all week. If you are on stage, you have established your credibility on 3 points. The selection committee thought that you should give the talk, so you're qualified. The people in the seats read your abstract and showed up, so you're qualified to be there. And third, you're actually qualified. You put together the talk, you have the life experience, you have something to talk about, you're actually qualified. And so you shouldn't feel imposter syndrome. And so this is the other side of the coin. Telling someone they shouldn't feel imposter syndrome is stupid and disrespectful, and I get that. And particularly if you don't look like the other people in the audience, there is a tendency to want to establish your credibility by giving your life story. But understand to keep that as short as possible, because you only have a few minutes, and that can be challenging. All right, I can say so much more about that, but I'm going to move on to point 3, which is to show pictures of your cat. The point here is that your slides are not your presentation. You are your presentation. Giving a presentation is a performance, not a document. If you want to write a document, write a document. And I encourage you to write that document. I encourage you, after your talk, to write the blog post. And I will be doing that. But this is a performance. Now, it's also pedagogy. It's teaching. And so you want to balance that thing. You're not up here to give a clown show, but you do need to be engaging. And your slides are there to keep people looking up at the stage so that they're not playing Candy Crush, but they're not the whole presentation. And so please, I beg you, I implore you, do not do this. Do not make me read your slides, because I have terrible vision. And I don't want to read your slides. If I want to read your document, then I will read your document. Now, most of your content shouldn't be on the screen. If your slides are your presentation, why are you here? Now, I want to show you another slide that doesn't have words on it, but this is an actual slide from a presentation that I attended earlier this year. And this slide was made by somebody from Amazon who had gone through the speaker certification training. So I don't know what happened. Somewhere along the line, they thought that this was reasonable to put on the screen. I would encourage you not to do that. But I would also encourage you to put as few words on the screen as possible. I try really hard not to put words on the screen unless it is a specific thought that I want someone to retain and repeat in their dreams tonight. Now, I'm cheating here because this is not a technical presentation. If you are giving a technical presentation, sometimes you'll have to put code on the screen. Sometimes you'll have to put, specific technical terms on the screen. But when you do, don't do that, because those folks in the back can't read that. What I would encourage you to do is zoom in on the specific part of the code that you are referencing and highlight that and draw lots of arrows or circles or whatever, and then put a URL, which unfortunately I did poorly here. That text color is very poor there. It should have been something brighter. But put a link on the screen where people can read the whole code, because, I don't really want you reading my code anyway because I'm not a programmer. But create a link or a QR code where they can observe the whole code at their leisure. Don't expect them to read code on screen because that's not how real people think. All right, point number 4, a presentation is a conversation. Watch your audience, see when they're falling asleep, do a little dance when they fall asleep, try to talk with them. This can be super challenging when you're giving a talk online. Too many of the presentations I give these days are online, and that is very, very challenging because I'm looking out here and trying to gauge whether you all are listening to me, and some of you aren't, and that's fine. But try to have a conversation with your audience. Now, the tip here is don't let anyone in your audience hijack your talk. There's always that guy in the audience, and I say guy very specifically because it's always a guy, who says, I don't really have a question, it's more of a comment, and it comes in 7 parts. And you need to practice saying, let's take that question out to the hallway afterwards. Or even better, you're not here, these people are not here to listen to you, they're here to listen to me. Let's talk about this later. Find a way to be polite but firm about that. Do not let someone hijack your talk because that's not what people are here for. Having a friendly heckler in the audience can be a very powerful way to loosen up the audience. And I've done that in the past. I've had a plant in the audience to heckle me, and that's always fun. All right, point number 5, an even more practical tip. This object here is a microphone. The microphone allows the people in the back to hear. If you're at a conference where it's recorded, it allows the people who are watching online to hear. And anytime that you hear someone say, I speak loud enough, I don't need a microphone, they're wrong. Everybody needs the microphone. The microphone is not just for amplification, it also does tone balancing, all sorts of things. We have very talented people here who put together the sound system back here and tuned it for this room. And furthermore, I am extremely hard of hearing. And when you don't use the mic, I leave very consistently because if I can't understand your words, then I am wasting my time and yours. So, use the microphone. Now, the microphone, just a little bit of tip here. It doesn't work when you hold it here. It doesn't work when it's on the table. And most microphones are structured so that you speak into the end, not the side. And maybe you can hear the difference between that. It makes a huge difference, again, particularly for people like myself that are very hard of hearing. And so arrive a little bit early. Test the microphone, make sure you know how it works because this microphone's different. This microphone, you speak into the side of it because it's a studio mic. And this one is the one at my desk and it's got weird capsules on different sides for different types of sound. Make sure you know how to use the mic. But most of them look like this and you speak into the end. Tip number 6, watch yourself, record yourself and watch yourself. Now, I have been giving presentations for 30 years, and when I first watched video of myself, I was appalled because I had all of these weird verbal tics. I had watched someone give a presentation at some point who had a verbal tic, and it was actually Damien, the guy I showed you at the beginning, and he had this weird tic. It wasn't a stutter per se, but he would repeat himself, and I picked up that verbal tic, and it wasn't me, it was something I was mimicking. But I really encourage you to listen to yourself, listen to how many times you say and you know, and whatever. Practice not doing that. One thing that I find is very effective is to pause rather than use stop words. It makes you sound thoughtful. You might not be. You might just be trying to remember what you were supposed to say next. But it makes you sound more intelligent than when you say, Other things that you might do is touch your face a lot, or fiddle with your buttons, or fiddle with things in your pockets. Watch video of yourself. It's very instructive. Watch other speakers and see what irritates you about them, and practice not doing that. Now, I recognize that some of you literally write your slides in the lunch break before your talk. And I don't want to be disrespectful. I know that that works for some of you. That absolutely does not work for me. I've had this presentation written for 3 months. I've rewritten it a couple times. I've given it to a test audience before. And practicing is super important for me. It might not be for you, and I recognize that some people don't have the same sort of stage fright that I do. And like I said, I've been giving talks for 30 some years, but I always get the sweats when I get up on stage. So if that's you, practice. Slow down. This is especially important if you are speaking to an international audience, if you're speaking somewhere that is not your home country. Make sure that you slow down. I've attended talks where the people spoke so quickly that I simply could not understand what they were saying, and it's super important when people are listening in a language that is not their native language. Dramatic pauses, like I said, make you seem intelligent, which is of course nonsense. But a lot of what you do on stage is psychology. One of the things that I do on stage is that I will look someone in the eyes and speak directly to them, and that makes them awkward, makes them feel awkward when they look back at their phone later on. They're like, is he looking at me? So yeah, that's a good thing. When you slow down, you also end up not saying at the end of the talk, well, I'm going to give you 15 minutes back, and people feel shortchanged. They feel like, I came for a 30-minute presentation on this thing, and they got done in 10 minutes, and maybe I should have gone to a different talk. The next thing I recommend is lots of short beats. Now, when I started at Amazon, I was required to take speaker certification training, which I found insulting because I had been giving presentations for 30 years at that point. And I actually learned a lot from that training, and one of the terms that stuck in my mind was beats. And you want beats during your talk. Now this has a number of reasons. One is that it keeps people looking up at the screen because they'll look down and there'll be a visual joke and everyone will laugh and they'll be like, what did I miss? And then they start paying more attention. So it's another psychological trick. But also, switching the view intentionally, repeatedly, is part of keeping attention, but it's also part of making specific points. Every time I put up a new slide, this is a visual cue for myself to make a particular point. Slides act as cue cards for me more than they act as information for you. So this is Neil Peart, who's the drummer for Rush, and there he is making a beat. And switching the view keeps that beat, it keeps that rhythm, it keeps people engaged. I try to have 1 slide per minute in my presentations. Now, I have attended presentations that had 2 slides, and they were on the screen for 32 minutes apiece, and by the end of it, I was doing something else. I was multitasking, which means I was ignoring the presenter. Having a cadence is good. Have your own cadence, but I really strongly recommend you don't leave anything up on the screen for more than 2 minutes, because after 2 minutes, somebody's back to checking their email. They're back to playing Candy Crush. Now, as part of this, I recommend that you get familiar with your presentation tool. I have been in a lot of presentations where people don't seem to know how their presentation tool works. Now, most presentation tools have a timer. This particular dialogue is from the presentation tool that is developed by the training project at Apache, training.apache.org. I recommend you have a look at it. It has a lot of sample presentations for Apache projects, And you can download and use these presentations for yourself, customize them a little bit. But the coolest feature of it, in my mind, is this thing. You tell it how long you have to give your talk, and it gives you a timeout timer for each slide. It says, you have 1 minute and 36 seconds left on this slide before you really should be moving on. You're wasting everybody's time. So get to know your presentation tool. There are so many of them out there to choose from. Some of them are good, some of them not so good. And they all have a feature like this. Point 9, a picture is worth 1,000 words. This is a photograph by our event photographer, Chris, and it is from our conference in Montreal, I think. Yes. And this is me and Daniel having a conversation there. And this was 6 years ago. And to this day, when I look at that picture, it evokes a memory. And it makes me laugh, it makes me smile, and your goal with picking pictures for your presentation is to create a psychological link between the point that you're making and an image. And that image doesn't always have to be directly representative of what you're talking about, but funny images are often very effective. Not only in creating that mental link, but also in if somebody in the audience giggles, that everybody else looks back up and you've re-engaged the eyes. So I would encourage you, whenever possible, to put a picture on the screen instead of words. This is a little bit of a reiteration of my earlier point, but I really encourage you to go find photographs, subscribe to a stock photograph service, or take your own pictures. I usually try to take my own pictures, but I also use a lot of pictures from Flickr that are under Creative Commons licenses. This is from photos.apachecon.com, which has photographs from all of our conferences going back 20 years, and there's a lot of really great pictures in there. So yeah, pictures, lots of pictures. So to summarize, know what your talk is about so that I do as well. Don't tell me your life story. You are your presentation, not your slides. Presentation should be a conversation, and I don't necessarily just mean in words, I mean also in exchanging, watching the faces of your audience. One of the things that I found very challenging about presenting in Japan was that the audience was much more reserved, and it was hard to judge, not only because of the cultural disconnect, because I didn't understand the culture. I thought that I was being boring. And again, I mentioned earlier, I'm reading this autobiography by a musician, and he talked about their first concert in Japan where everybody sat politely and listened, and how disconcerting that was. So I encourage you to understand your audience a little bit. And that's really a point I should have made before. Your audience precedes everything. Understand who your audience is before you talk to them. I suppose that should be point 0 or something. Anyway, use the microphone, record and watch yourself. Lots of short beats, and a picture is worth 1,000 words. So there's my presentation. Oh, also, always have a bonus slide. Have something tucked away at the end in case you finish too early. Have a slide at the end that goes into a deeper depth. And I don't actually have any in this presentation. But if you run out of time if you run out of content before you run out of time, you have failed your audience. And so I encourage you to have a little bit of extra content that goes into some of the deeper points that people might ask about. Anticipate questions and put that in your bonus slides. This is particularly useful if you've ever given a presentation before. As soon as you step off stage, write down all the questions that you were asked. Maybe they're not part of your main content, but somebody's going to ask that next time as well. So be sure that you have that content available to you when someone says, well, you really should have covered this particular thing, and you can be, aha, and skip forward 6 slides and say, here's the bonus slide that has that content. So, question time. Leave time for questions unless you don't want to answer questions. Now, that is a legitimate position. If you're giving a press conference, maybe you want everything in your prepared statements and you don't want to answer questions. If you are speaking on behalf of your employer, maybe you're not allowed to take questions. When I am speaking on behalf of Amazon, I'm not always supposed to take questions depending on the topic, because somebody can back me into a corner and ask me an awkward question. There have been times when I was giving a presentation for my employer and was asked an awkward question and said something that ended up in the news, twisted the wrong way. Maybe you don't want that to happen, but if you are going to leave time for questions, make sure that you encourage people to use the microphone to ask questions, and that you repeat the question for the audience. So in the keynote this morning, there were several questions that I simply couldn't hear at all, and then, it was you. But then, when the speaker does not repeat that question, I don't know what they're addressing. And so it takes me 5 or 6 sentences to get the concept of what it is that they're answering. And that is very challenging. Again, I'll mention it again, I'm deaf. So make sure that you give people the microphone if they want to ask questions. Be wary of the not a question but a comment person and shut them down quickly. If somebody starts expounding on one of your points, say, I encourage you to submit that talk next year. And then finally, tell people where your slides are, preferably right there at the end of the presentation so that they can go look at your slides. 90% of this talk is in the speaker notes. So when you see the picture of my cat, that's not really a slide about my cat, obviously, but there's a lot of content in the speaker notes. This presentation is on my GitHub account. All of my pictures are accredited. Make sure that you do not use pictures that you do not have the legal right to use, especially if you're presenting on behalf of your employer, so they can get in trouble. I shamelessly stole the picture of Damien from YouTube, but the rest of them are under Creative Commons licenses or were taken by me. So, that's it. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, sir.
So I saw a lot of presentations already which kind of violate a whole bunch of what you said. Do you guys or thinking of having some sort of pre-check of people's slides or something like that to make sure that, this doesn't happen? Because a lot of it's kind of common sense.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, whether we pre-check slides. And we've been doing this conference since 1998, and for the first 2 or 3 years we required that people give us their slides ahead of time. And of course nobody did. And so eventually we dropped that requirement. And once again, I acknowledge that some people are giving a talk in the next hour and are writing their slides now. But when I give talks for my employer, they require that the slides be submitted beforehand and that there is a practice run of the presentation beforehand. And that is expensive because somebody has to review those. So what you find is that most conferences of this type simply don't have any requirement like that. But the other half of that question is that the community development project, community.apache.org, has volunteers that will help you with your abstract and are willing to coach on slides ahead of time if you show up and request it. We don't publicize that a whole lot, but it is something that we have offered at every one of these conferences going back about 10 years. So if you want that, we're there for it. Yes? Hold on, they were first back here.
For people who might find a 40-minute talk a bit daunting to start with, do you have any tips for them on how to practice with smaller things that might be a better start?
So the question is regarding 40-minute talks being terrifying, and we have a couple answers to this. One is that we have the lightning talks on Thursday night, and I would encourage you, if you have something you want to talk about, but only have 5 minutes of thoughts, then sign up for the lightning talks on Thursday night, and those talks are a lot of fun. Some of them are funny, some of them are deeply technical, some of them are boring, but they're over in 5 minutes. And so this is a great way to practice. The other thing that I recommend is that you give a talk to your friends, your coworkers, who are able to be honest with you but will be kind. And I encourage the people on my team to give talks to one another in order to build up their speech muscle, you might say. So there's a lot of ways, and local meetups are another great way to do this. Local meetups are a more friendly audience, and you can ply them with beer and pizza to make them more friendly. And that's another thing that I strongly encourage, is you find your local meetup groups if you live in a town that's a little larger than where I live. All right, any other questions? I'm not sure how much time I have left. I have about 5 minutes. I have time for just a couple more questions.
Yeah, I just wanted to say to this sort of like pre-check. So I remember whenever I submitted something to the Community Over Code Asia events, they sometimes do actually request people to pre-record it in order to sort of like be able to sort of like write subtitles or pre-process and stuff like that. So some conferences actually do.
Yes, and if you're going to give a talk in a setting where people will primarily speak another language, it is good to make it ahead of time, both for translation purposes, but also for culturally sensitive things that you might say. And the thing that Chris didn't mention is that when you give a talk in China, you want to be careful about putting maps in your presentation. And you might not think about this because maps are very politically sensitive in some parts of the world, so don't do that. Anyway.
How do you build your confidence?
The question is how you build your confidence, and this is practice is really the only way to do this. And one of the things that I learned very early on is that one negative comment weighs about the same as 100 positive comments, and it can be very challenging to give those equal balance. And so the other thing that I encourage you to do is to listen to positive feedback, and for the most part, ignore negative feedback. But that's really hard to do. That's really difficult. And so repeated practice is the only thing that has worked for me. And yet, even now, like I said, 30 years, I'm up here sweating bullets, and I always have this moment halfway through the talk where I'm like, I'm going too fast, and I forgot the things that I was going to say, and why is anybody even listening to me? So all of that is just to say, the seasoned speakers are also super nervous. And if you're feeling a little bit nervous, then try to channel that into your energy and your passion. And understand that all of these people showed up to listen to me after reading my abstract. And so that's a vote of confidence, hopefully. So it's practice is really the main answer there. Any other questions? Oh, yeah, thank you. Yeah.
So for the beats part, for all other points, I understand how I can approach it. For beats in the slide, I don't get the real guideline. How can I approach to that? So do you have any pointers that I can follow to have beats in my presentation? So
help you what? I'm sorry.
So for all other points, I know how I can achieve those. For adding beats to the slide, I don't get beats. That beats thing you mentioned. I don't know how to do that in the slides.
I'm not sure how to answer that. But again, practicing and practicing and practicing is really the most effective way, I think.
Kind of follow up on it. I don't know if you like music, but if you listen to music, you have a verse and a chorus. And so if you kind of think of your presentation in that style, I don't know if that's.
I guess, yeah, that's part of it. Maybe another answer is to what I do is I write an outline and I write chapters, and I go through and cross half of them out because maybe they're not relevant. Another thing is for beats is that there were several of those slides where I could have given a half-hour presentation on that one point. And when I find and you may have seen me doing this when I started, I was like, I have 5 more things to say about this, and I have to intentionally cut myself off and try and find the one most important thing. And I guess that's really what I would say, is to write an outline and figure out what the most important thing is about that point, and then write the blog post later. I don't know. It's challenging, and it takes a lot of practice to get to that cadence. Yeah. You take this all the way to the back. You had your turn.
Thanks, almost out of time. Any thoughts on creative use of space, moving up and down the aisles, engaging with people, and not standing behind a podium? I've gotten mixed advice about that.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I tend to hide behind the podium. The question was about using the space that you have available. I also have a camera here, and I've stepped out of frame a number of times, and every time I step out, I'm like, should I step back in here? But yeah, that was one of the things that was covered in that presentation training that I went to at Amazon, was be very intentional about stepping out from behind your protection here. So I have this armor here, and it protects me from the audience. And for the first 10 years that I was giving presentations, I never moved from behind the podium. And one of the things that they recommended in that training was have a prop up on stage, and maybe sit down sometimes, or maybe do the William Riker maneuver and strike an awkward pose. And by doing that, you draw attention to yourself. You make people laugh, and those people that were on their phones looked up and they're like, "What did I miss?" Having a prop, having like a high chair, a tall chair on stage is one way to do that. But part of it being a conversation is coming out into the audience and stepping out of your comfort zone. And I am a complete introvert, and so being on stage, I do like the safety of the podium. But I have, in fact, been very intentional about that. Maybe not as much as I could, but yeah, I do encourage you to use all the space that you have. But one caveat there is, if someone is filming the presentation, make sure that you talk to them beforehand and figure out how far is too far, how much they're going to step off stage, and whether they care. So, yeah, there's a lot of... I actually attended a complete hour-long presentation on that topic, so there's a lot that can be said there. So, how much time do I have? I have time for one more question. All right.
My question is about speaker notes. Do you look at them when you're giving your talk? What do you use them for?
So regarding speaker notes, I have extensive speaker notes that are on my screen that you can't see. And the thing that I would encourage you to do is not write a script. Because if you write a script, then you're up here looking at it and reading it. Don't use photos you don't have the rights to, because that's rude and illegal. And that looks dumb, and also it sounds stilted. So what I try to do is put, if I want to use a specific phrase, I will put that in my notes in bold. But otherwise, I've just put bullet points there that say, these are the main points that I want to cover. These are the main anecdotes or stories that I want to incorporate. And that gives me the opportunity to sort of riff on it, and every presentation is unique, but I'm still going to cover the topics. The other thing that it keeps me from doing is rambling endlessly on one particular slide, because I could quite happily do that. And so this keeps me on track. And the third thing that it does is ensure when I have a point that spans 3 or 4 slides, and there's something specific that I want to say that went with the picture on the 3rd slide, I don't say it on the 1st slide, and then come to the 3rd slide and say, well, I already said this, but. And you'll hear a lot of presenters doing that. They'll say, well, I already covered this, but I want to say something more about this. And that feels awkward, and it feels like you're wasting people's time. So, Chris, did you have a...
Yeah, well, I just wanted to say that my speaker notes, a big part of it is actually it's like telling me not to go into this now because it's coming 3 slides later. So.
Yeah, that's a really good point. If you're curating your beats, then you want to make sure that the beat goes with the image and vice versa. So, anyway, I am, I think, completely out of time. Yes, I am. I'm 27 seconds over. So thank you so much for coming. Go give awesome talks.